So a little bit more about me. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at UCSC. My work focuses on forms of sexuality that are not typical or that fall outside of normal kind of typical sexuality we would see in daily life. So this includes things like masochism, so people that are sexually attracted to having pain inflicted on them or being tied up. Sadism, where people are sexually attracted to inflicting pain on other people. Fetishism, where people are sexually attracted to objects or materials or parts of the body that aren't genitals, and anything else that you can imagine that falls outside of social norms. Those are the kinds of things that I study. I've done work that has looked at where kinks come from and where kinky people see their own kinks as coming from, works on how kinks develop over time, work on how kinky people find or don't find access to kink communities of other people that share their interests. And then I'm currently involved in a project where we are analyzing the sex education questions of 4th through 12th grade students that they submit through an anonymous question box, many of which are about kink. So that's a little sort of snapshot of the work that I do. My work has appeared both in major academic journals as well as in Vice and Psychology Today. So that's just a little bit of background on me. So today I'm going to be talking about the social psychology of kink. And so I use the word kink as a sort of broad overview, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what I mean when I say kink. But to give you a sense of what this talk is going to look like today, first I'm going to define what kink is. Second, I'm going to give you an overview of all these theories as to why people are kinky and why people have these desires, and then provide a little bit of the background on my own theory about where I think the kinks come from that I'm going to be defending a little bit later this year. Then I'll be talking about consent in the kink community and different standards of consent that are used. I'll give you a little bit of background on the history of feminist thought on kink and how it is that feminists both agree and disagree on elements of kink. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about how kink relates to other identities like gender and race and what happens in the kink community when those things collide. So to start off with, what is kink? So when I use the word kink, I'm describing something that's socially constructed, meaning that as a society, we're collectively deciding what makes something kinky and what makes something not kinky. So for example, you might imagine that what's kinky in San Francisco, a place where there's a lot of kinky people, right, it might be quite different than what's kinky in rural Alabama, right? So in rural Alabama, it might be, having sex with the lights on is something that's thought of as kinky. Whereas in San Francisco, you might hear like, look, we get it, you're tied up and you're dressed as Superman, but you're not even being lit on fire. That's not kinky, right? So it's socially constructed, right? It's going to vary by time and it's going to vary by place. The second is that it has to be consensual. So that means that the people have to agree to the activities that they're engaging in together. If it's not something they're agreeing on, that's sexual assault or abuse. That's not kink. I want to clarify that while kink often is something that people are doing with a partner, it's also something that can be done alone. So people that are masturbating to particular kinds of pornography or particular fantasies are going through their heads, they're engaging in some form of kink alone. I also want to emphasize that while for some people this is a really sexual activity and it involves a lot of genitals and active sexual activities, for other people this isn't sexual at all. In fact, there's lots of people that are asexual in the kink community that don't experience sexual attraction to other people but still enjoy a lot of these activities. And then lastly, a lot of people think of kink as being sort of about power, as this like domination and submission thing, and for some people that's definitely part of their kink, whereas for other people that's not part of their kink at all. So kink is this really loose concept that applies to a variety of different intimate and sexual and non-sexual activities that fall outside of social norms that people are doing either together or alone. And kinks tend to vary really widely. So on the previous page, you saw pictures of what we might typically think of as kink, right? Domination and submission, people in chains, people getting beaten. But it also involves a wide variety of different fetishes. So here I've got images of hypnosis fetish pornography. Some people have fetishes for cigarettes and are sexually attracted to people who are smoking. Adult diaper baby play is in the left bottom corner, where people are interested in taking on the roles of a baby. And foot fetishes is a fairly common one. And kinks vary so widely that often we can see kinks that will range from really wild fantasies to really realistic ones. So on the one hand, you might have somebody that wants to be in a hyper-realistic full body cast, the kind of thing you might see from somebody who has a terrible ski accident. right? And on the other hand, you might have people that want to be like shrunk down to the size of an infant. We also have examples like cuckolding, so people that are sexually attracted to someone else having sex with their partner, or their partner having sex with someone else. And likewise, kink can take lots of different forms. Everything from sort of your traditional like maid outfit to what's going on in the middle here, which is fire play. This is someone that has shaving cream on their back. It's a really high alcohol shaving cream, the kind of really cheap stuff you can get at a dollar store, and it's being lit on fire, which creates both a painful but also really intense sensation. It's sort of like fire massage. People that are into balloons are up in the top right corner, and people that are into gunge fetishism, sometimes called wet and messy fetishism, that involves anything from being covered in pudding to different kinds of food or mud or different substances. All of these things are things that fall under kink. So why do people do this, right? Why are these interests that some people have? So there's a really, really long history of people trying to make guesses as to why people have these particular desires. So early on in medieval and Renaissance times, we have some doctors that are making claims like women are more likely to conceive if they are being hit at the same time. And so in order to improve the likelihood of conception, that's why people are doing this. Or from an old witch hunting manual from 1487, the claim why women were going outside in the woods and getting naked with each other was because the devil had tempted them into doing it. More recently, once we have theories that are starting to at least focus on early forms of science, we get theories that focus on behavioral conditioning. So conditioning is the idea that if you pair something with something else, that over time those things become associated with each other. And so over time you'll get one thing becomes sexual attraction if it's paired with sexual attraction. So the photo that I have on the left over here is an example from the study by Pfaus and his colleagues, where they knit tiny jackets for lab rats, and then they had the male lab rats have sex with female lab rats over the course of a long period of time in order to try and condition them to associate wearing the tiny jacket with being sexually aroused. And then they found at the end of the study that when they compared rats that had been wearing these tiny jackets with rats that had not been wearing those tiny jackets, that the rats who had been wearing the tiny jackets took much longer to ejaculate into the female rats if they didn't have the jacket available. And so this is the sort of behavioral conditioning view of where kinks come from. You also had some stuff really early on in psychoanalysis, so the kinds of things that Freud was doing, where they were arguing that cleaning your infant's genitals too roughly would cause them to develop a masochistic desire later in life. Claims that what's really going on is that people have these repressed incest fantasies where they want to have sex with their parents, and because that's unacceptable, they develop this subconscious desire to be punished for it, and that's why people get into being punished in a sexual context. One psychoanalyst argued that what's really going on is people feel this need for control to compensate over, for example, the death of a parent. And so in order to compensate for it, they want to engage in these kink activities in order to have control over others. There's even one group of researchers that was arguing that spanking your children and then hugging them like confuses their ideas of love and pain, and that's what's ultimately causing kink. And it goes on even beyond that. So Richard von Krafft-Ebing wrote in Psychopathia Sexualis, a book that was published in the late 1800s and one of the first books that tried to actually categorize these things. He was arguing that what was really going on was some sort of racial degeneration. So he's writing at this very racist time in science, and he's making arguments like the following. The development of this grade of civilization is furthered by the conditions of frigid climes which necessitate the protection of the body against the cold. It is an anthropological fact that modesty can be traced to much earlier periods among northern races. This development is hastened whenever nomadic habits yield to the spirit of colonization. The Egyptians, the Israelites, and the Greeks reached this level at early periods, as did the Teutonic races. There are some nations, Persians and Russians, where the women regard blows as a peculiar sign of love and favor. So this is like fucked up bad science, right? So this is somebody that is starting with the presupposition that like racial hierarchies exist, and that's what explains why people have either normal sexuality or sexuality that is degenerate in some way, right? And these kinds of ideas have largely been discredited today because they're based on like wild pseudoscience. He also had some of the classical conditioning ideas that were going on that continue to persist into this day. So he was arguing that the reason some people might have spanking fetishes, so they're sexually attracted to spanking, may have to deal with when they're being spanked by their parent, that there's these accidental feelings that their penis is getting when they're over their parent's lap. And so that's what's causing them to associate sexuality with spanking. And then a little bit later on, we have Freud, who made the even more wild claim that what's going on is boys see their mothers naked, realize their mom doesn't have a penis, start to freak out and think that they might lose their penis. And so in order to avoid freaking out, they come up with some other object which represents their mother's missing penis, and then that becomes their fetish object over time. So like, this is the stuff that was being written in the 1900s. But there's some problems with a lot of these views. And one of the major problems is that a lot of these views would sort of assume that anything could become a fetish, that any object that exists out there could be something that somebody would be interested in. And Rule 34 of the internet, if you've heard that before, if it exists, there is porn of it, right, would also predict the same kind of thing. But in reality, there actually are a much smaller number of things that are generally typically fetishized, and there's a much larger number of things that almost nobody has a fetish for in the world. At least based on a sort of quick analysis of 5.5 million people on FetLife, the world's largest social networking website for kinky people, basically nobody in the world, or less than 10 people in the world, have a fetish for these very common household objects. And so you would anticipate that if it was some sort of classical conditioning pairing kind of things, that lots of people would have fetishes for lamps, which might happen to be around while they're masturbating. Or lots of people might have fetishes for college-bound spiral notebooks, which you can form into a tube and simulate intercourse with it. And horny middle school students use it to cover up their erections when they're feeling uncomfortable, right? It has these sort of ingredients for what you might imagine would be a fetish, but pretty much nobody has a fetish for notebooks. And I think even more importantly, almost nobody has a fetish for tissue paper, even though for a lot of men who are ejaculating, the moment of ejaculation, the highest moment of sexual feeling, is paired with a piece of tissue paper. But yet almost nobody has a fetish for tissue paper. And so if it was just this like classical conditioning pairing kind of thing, right, you'd imagine that would be the world's most widely popular fetish. So we continue to see even more ideas that were coming out about where these things come from, especially as we moved past the 1960s and we started to see a lot of movements like the feminist movement and the civil rights movement and post-colonial movements. These are all leftist movements that started to think of society more critically. So we have, for example, Norris in 1982 writing that what's really going on is women have so deeply internalized the patriarchy that they've come to desire their own submission. And so what's really going on is that there are women and they're interested in submitting, and the whole reason why they're interested in submitting is because they've been brainwashed by the patriarchy. And then later we saw similar kinds of ideas that racial fetishes for Asian women are largely produced by these like neo-colonial oppressive framings of Asian women, where you get all of these media narratives that talk about Asian women as like docile and submissive, and so then that becomes a racial fetish for a lot of people. And then even further, we got more psychoanalysts saying that what's really going on is people are like consciously aware of themselves and they find that stressful, and so they try to escape that conscious awareness by engaging in a bunch of pain. There's more recent theory that spent a lot of time talking about sexual trauma and trying to argue that what's really going on is that these are all sexual assault survivors who have been so deeply brainwashed by their sexual assault experiences that they've come to like think that they actually wanted it. Later on, you have people that are saying that what's really going on is insecure attachment. So as infants, they weren't able to develop a secure attachment with their parent, and so that led to them using sexual coping strategies for sex, and that's why they're sex offenders today. And then you have people that are arguing more recently that what's really going on is that we have these parts of our mind that we shove back and say aren't part of us. The Jungian shadow is what this is sometimes called. And what's really going on is people are trying to explore that part of their mind. And then probably most hilariously and most recently, one paper has argued that having cats and getting infected with toxoplasmosis, which is a disease that many cats have in their poop, is what's ultimately causing a lot of kinky people to become kinky. Part of the reason for this particular one is that when rats are infected with toxoplasmosis from cat poop, they become sexually attracted to cats, and that makes it easier for the cats to catch the rats. And so they're thinking that like sexual attraction to danger is what's really going on. So as you can see, there's a wild, wild number of theories that exist about why these things are happening. But there's a huge amount of problems with most of this research. So one of the biggest problems is that almost none of this research is conducted with actual kinky people that are out there in the world. Instead, most of it is either conducted in clinical contexts, so someone is a therapist and they have somebody that's coming in and saying, I have this sexual interest, it's ruining my relationship, there's something wrong with me, please fix me. They're doing animal studies where they're putting tiny jackets on rats. Or they're doing criminal samples where they're largely focusing on convicted sex offenders or people that are pedophiles. And the problem with that kind of framing is that by trying to make assumptions about where kinks come from based on these really distressed samples, or these samples that are very different from the millions and millions of kinky people that are just out there in the world, then we might get some really wild ideas, like assuming that everyone must be traumatized. Similarly, almost all these studies assume that this is some form of sickness or disease or pathology, that this is something that needs to be cured and corrected and controlled. And as we know from the vast majority of kinky people that are out there enjoying their lives, that doesn't seem to be the case. Further, most of these studies have really low sample sizes. Almost none of these studies have more than 50 people in them. Even some of the studies that have tried to do like classical conditioning on humans by trying to get them to masturbate to images of jars of pennies, like those usually only have 20 or fewer subjects, right? Even further is that a lot of these theories are unfalsifiable. So what that means is that there's no way to test them and for those theories to turn out to be wrong. There's no way in the world that you could conduct an experiment that would demonstrate whether or not being spanked and hugged by your parents causes you to have a fetish later in life. That these are often untestable kinds of theories. And then lastly, and this is from some of my own perspectives, that I think it discounts the real experiences of kinky people. That ultimately, people are generally experts in their own lives. They know their own experiences pretty well. They know their own minds pretty well. And by doing this through the lens of what clinical experts or academic experts or legal experts are saying, that it sort of obfuscates or it makes cloudy what's really going on in their lives. It adds this extra layer of someone else who's the expert saying, here's what's really going on. And so a lot of my work instead focuses on hearing from the voices of kinky people themselves and doing interviews and doing surveys to actually hear from their own words. And so the theory that I've adopted, which I think does a pretty good job of explaining where most kinks come from in response to a lot of the voices of real participants in my studies, is based on Fritz Heider's balance theory. Has anybody heard of balance theory before? Most people haven't. It's really old. It's from like 1957, and it's a precursor to something called cognitive dissonance. Have people heard of cognitive dissonance before? Okay, so a few people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll this up so I can get a little bit more space. I'm going to shut the projector off for a moment. There we go. Okay. So balance theory is a theory that makes predictions about how people's minds work based on consistency between different parts of their mind. So I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that you have a relationship that's represented with a triangle between you, your romantic or sexual partner, and horror movies. So let's say you like your partner, and you don't like horror movies, and your partner likes horror movies. So we use pluses to represent things that are working together really nicely, and minuses for things that are in conflict. Has anybody been in a relationship where this is true? Yeah, okay. So what balance theory predicts is that this is uncomfortable, that there's some sort of psychological discomfort that goes along with that. And so given enough time and enough pressure, one of these three sides of the triangle will change to the opposite. So either you'll come to appreciate or tolerate horror movies a little bit more, or your partner will come to appreciate horror movies less, or you'll come to hate your partner, right? So one of those three things will happen. And the one that's going to change is usually the one that's the least strongly held, right? So if you don't like horror movies, but it's not super important to you, that's probably the one that's going to change. If your partner likes horror movies, but doesn't love horror movies, that's probably the one that's going to change. And if you've been dating for 2 days, this might be the thing that's going to change, right? So the same thing is true for the way that people relate to ideas in their own mind. So for example, we might draw another triangle, and the relationship could be between you being a good person and giving to charity. So let's imagine you think of yourself as a good person, so we put a plus there. You think of good people as people who give to charity, so we put a plus there. And you don't give to charity, so we put a minus there. This feels uncomfortable, right? Like this is how every Feed the Children commercial ever works. So Given enough time and enough pressure, balance theory predicts one of these three things will change. So either you'll change your behavior and you'll start giving to charity, or you'll say, I guess I'm not a good person, oh well. Or you'll go through some cognitive gymnastics to decide that good people may not necessarily be people that give to charity. So you might say, I don't have a lot of money right now, so I can still be a good person, but I just don't have the ability to do this right now. Right? So this is how balance theory works. You have relationships between three things. It's uncomfortable for those relationships to be in some sort of discordance or to be in conflict. And so instead, one of the three sides changes in order to try to resolve that conflict. So what does this have to do with kinky sex? So we'll imagine one more triangle. And the relationships in this triangle would be you, sexuality, and stress. So let's imagine you don't like stress. You're all college students, that's generally true, right? You like sex, and that sex is a form of stress relief for you. So this is a balanced triangle, right? If these two are minuses and this is a plus, if you were to multiply them all together, you'd get a positive, and so that's a balanced triangle. There's no psychological discomfort that's here. If you don't like stress and you do like sex, and sex is a form of stress relief, meaning it reduces your stress, then that's something that feels pretty good. So my argument is that if this is a particularly strongly held thing, so for people that use sex as a way of de-stressing, that relationships with other triangles are also going to be affected by that. So here, we might put something like being in power. So you might imagine, for example, like the CEO of a major corporation, right? This is someone who is very stressed out by being in power. And there's a positive relationship here. Being in power causes them stress, right? They have a super high power job, they're in charge of a bunch of people, and they find that to be stressful. So if this is a particularly strongly held one, and this is a particularly strongly held one, then we would expect this one would be negative in order to make the triangle balanced. Meaning that being in power is not a sexy thing for them. They are not going to find being in power to be sexy. On the other hand, we'll draw another triangle. They might find being submissive the opposite of being in power, so we use a minus here. They might find that to relieve stress. And in turn, they would find that sexy. And so all these triangles would be balanced. And so the theory that I've been proposing and trying to defend for the last year in this very long paper that I'm working on is that for many people, what's going on with their kink lives is they're sexualizing or recreationalizing the opposites of what cause them stress. So if you have daily life experiences that are causing stress around this, then you're going to sexualize the opposite of that. And so we might see that, for example, in wet and messy fetishism, the image of like people that are covered in shaving cream and pies and stuff before. So if somebody has a daily life experience where they're really stressed out about being super hygienic all day, you can imagine people that might work in food service or people that work in the healthcare industry, where you have to spend a lot of your time being super hygienic and clean, that being dirty or being messy might be something that becomes sexually attractive for someone who's using sex as a method of stress relief. Does that make sense for folks? So we'll even see this, for example, in some kinky people who have had experiences of sexual trauma in their past. So for example, an actual experience of sexual assault was an extremely stressful, extremely traumatic experience. So actual sexual assault. But for some of those people, they may also end up sexually desiring role-playing a sexual assault. And for a lot of people that are sexual assault survivors, that can be a really confusing experience. And so I would argue that the opposite of an actual sexual assault might be a simulated sexual assault in this model. And the reason that it might be opposite might be because of other triangles. So for example, in the actual sexual assault, the person may have felt powerless, or the person may have felt weak, or they may have felt like they wouldn't be able to stop it if they wanted to. Whereas in a simulated sexual assault, where they've actively negotiated it with a partner that they trust and care for, that this is something where they can feel like they have power in the situation, that they're actively deciding to do it, that they can stop it when they want through the use of a safe word, that they might feel like a strong, powerful person that can get through anything by being able to sort of process physically through an ordeal. And so this is why we might see some people who have experienced this kind of trauma may then sexualize that kind of trauma in a simulated kink context as a way to help process through that. So this is the theory that I've been arguing for why it is that people are interested in kink. So hopefully that's helpful, and if at the very end y'all are interested in doing like every fetish under the sun through this model, we can certainly do that. There's lots of interesting speculation to do. Okay, I'm gonna draw this back down. Turn this back on. Oh. Give this a shot. Yeah, there it is. Okay.
So for those that came in after I did my initial announcement, I just want to remind you, if you have questions that come up during Sam's lecture that you really want to ask, but it's not the right time, or you want to let him get through all of his PowerPoint, you can write your notes, your question on your note-taking sheet there, and then at the end of the time of this lecture, we should have some time to address questions.
Okay. So let's talk about consent. So consent is the thing that distinguishes between a kink activity and a form of sexual assault, that all of the parties that are involved agree to it. And you have some good examples of what consent might look like in a kink context. Over on the left here, we have a comic of someone that has made a heck yes, heck no, and heck maybe list. A list of things that they're very interested in, that they definitely don't want to do, and things that they might potentially be interested in. And this is the kind of conversation that a lot of kinky people go through before having a scene. They might go through checklists, they might have a more informal conversation, but they're actually talking about what it is specifically that they want to do before they start having sex. For people that have vanilla sex, meaning non-kinky sex, this is often not the kind of thing that people are doing. They're often not talking specifically about what it is they like and what it is that they don't like. And that can lead to some really terrible sex for a lot of people that are having regular sex. That, you know, if you don't tell your partner that you don't like being touched in the back of your knee because it makes you ticklish, and your partner thinks that you really like that, then that might not be a really good experience, right? And so for a lot of kinky couples, what they're engaging in is a ton of communication with each other, talking specifically about what it is they want and why it is that they're looking for that. We know in some kinky scenes, for example, that if one person says, I want to be spanked, and the other person says, I want to spank somebody, perfect, let's go. But one person wants to relive a traumatic childhood memory of being spanked by their father, and another person wants to have like cutesy birthday spankings. That may not be a very satisfying scene, right? And so talking not just about what people want to do, but also what they're looking to get out of it, and why they want to do it, becomes really important for having these satisfying relationships. And on the flip side, a lot of people find that things that they might not be super interested in initially might be things that they come to be interested in later. So in this comic panel up here, we have one partner saying, I thought it'd be fun if you tied me up, and the other one is saying, I guess, and then 3 weeks later, they're quite darn excited about doing this. So in the kink community, some people like to make the joke that the difference between hell no and hell yes is about 6 months. That for a lot of kinky people, you know, things that they may not initially be interested in, after seeing it and seeing other people doing it and seeing more about what that means, they may become more interested in it over time. So if you remember that fire video that I was showing earlier, right? If somebody were to ask like, hey, do you want to be lit on fire, right? A lot of people's reaction to that initially would be like, no, right? But when seeing sort of, well, some people might say, heck no. But after seeing a context like that, there might at least be some people who might be more interested in it. And so for some people, their experience in the kink community is sort of growing in what they're interested in over time. Consent in the kink community often is divided between 3 different ways of thinking about consent. So the 2 that are on the left are by far the most popular. The one that's on the right is a lot less popular than the other 2. So the first way of thinking about this is safe, sane, and consensual. And so the idea behind safe, sane, and consensual is that kink activities, like the kinds of kink that we do, should only take place if they're completely safe and if it's consensual. And there are certain kinds of activities, things like fire, that you should never be doing because those are way too risky. You are literally playing with fire, right? So that's the idea of safe, sane, and consensual. And there are some criticisms behind these ideas. So one is that no activities are ever going to be perfectly safe, right? If you are engaging in a foot fetish scenario where you're licking somebody's feet, you can still get toe fungus, right? That even something that we might think of as like extremely safe could potentially come with some risks. So that's a criticism of the idea that kink has to be safe. that nothing is ever safe. And so a better way of thinking about it might be this risk-aware consensual kink. Another critique is that by requiring that everything be sane, that it can be really ableist for people who might have particular mental disorders. Right? So someone might say, look, I am crazy. I take pills for that. This is part of my everyday life. Stop saying I can't do kinky shit. I love doing kinky shit. And so safe, sane, and consensual has sometimes been criticized on these kinds of grounds. A different way of looking at it is RAC, which stands for risk-aware consensual kink. And so this is the idea that even risky kink activities can be morally acceptable if everyone is fully informed of what all the risks are, willing to accept what those risks are, knowing that it might go wrong and somebody might get hurt in some way, and that everyone is consenting freely. So there's no coercion, there's no one that's forcing anybody else, nobody's being sort of tricked or duped into it. And there are some criticisms of this. So one criticism is that you might not know that your partner is uninformed about something, right? You may not know that your partner doesn't know something. And so there's certain kinds of risks to assuming everybody has to be perfectly knowledgeable. The last one, which is far less likely to be used, but does still exist in the kink community, is called PRIC. And so this is personal responsibility informed consensual kink. And so this is an idea that what makes something okay is that all of the participants are fully informed about the risks of the behavior. They consider them carefully, and they're consenting to accept those risks. Same thing as RAC. But the difference is that it's the personal responsibility of everyone informed to do that. Meaning that if you aren't informed and you're going into the scene and you said you've agreed to do it, it's your own fault if you didn't take the time to inform yourself. And so there's some criticisms of this, right? So one is that by emphasizing that people have to be personally responsible, there can be other power dynamics in a relationship that might be being ignored there, right? Some relationships are abusive. Some relationships are coercive. And so somebody may be being coerced into something or agreeing to do something that they may not be fully informed about, but the assumption that like it's their own fault can be this form of victim blaming. So there's some conflict between these different ideas in the kink community. And so sometimes what we'll see is a kink party that may only allow things in the left column and not allow anything in the right column. So they might say no fire, no electricity, no choking. Those are the kinds of things that are often more dangerous for people to participate in. So there may be some people in here, at least based on statistics, it's probably somewhere between like 10% and 15% of people who are interested in trying kink activities, or you may have already tried kink activities. For anybody who's especially new to kink, these are all some very useful tips that you might want to think through. One is to explore on your own first. Often the best strategy for figuring out what you're into is to watch a lot of porn, to fantasize, to explore on your own what your own desires are. The second is to consider joining FetLife. It's the world's largest social networking website for kinky people with 5.5 million users, and it has tons of resources for people that are new. The novices and newbies group on the site is the largest group in all of FetLife, and it has lots of resources. Third strategy would be to attend a munch. So these are low-key activities that take place in like public environments. So it might be a restaurant, it might be a bowling alley, where a bunch of kinky people are just getting together, hanging out, making friends, and getting the opportunity to meet one another. Workshops, like the kinds that are featured here, are also really good strategies. These are formal, like classroom environments where you're learning how to do kink things safely. If you're tying up your partner, you should probably know where the radial nerve is, and you should probably be aware of the kinds of damage that you might be able to potentially do nerve-wise to a partner if you're not being safe and not being careful. So these kinds of workshops can be helpful for that. Starting slow is always better than starting fast, right? You always want to leave somebody wanting more rather than going too far accidentally. Always negotiate first. Take the time to talk with the partner about what it is you're interested in and why. Use safe words, so use a word that you can clearly indicate that you want the scene to stop, or if you want to check in and slow something down. And lastly is safe calls, and this is true not just for kink context, but also for like any kind of online dating. So if you are meeting somebody, you should meet somebody in a public place for the first time, and you should have someone whose responsibility it is to call you, or someone whose responsibility it is for you to call them, and that if you don't do that, then they can know that you're in trouble. So if you're meeting somebody online, this is a way to stay safe and make sure you don't get kidnapped. Okay. So I'm going to move on a little bit here. So we've talked a lot about sort of the practical aspects, like how do you do consent, what does consent look like, and now I want to move on to a little bit more of a theoretical piece. So we often think of feminism as like one thing, but feminism is multiple different ideas that span a bunch of different political opinions and attitudes. And so one really big divide that exists in the feminist community is between sex positive and sex negative views of sexuality. So sex positive views are generally ones that are in favor of people as sort of free agents consenting freely to sex. And sex negative views are often attitudes that think about our consent being so conditioned by the societies that we live in that the consent is in some way not real. And so I've got some important tenets of both of them on the left and right here. So I'll start with sex positive. So this would be the view that pornography can be really helpful for people, that it's a really well-regulated industry, that people, just like any job, are consenting to engage in it, and they're helping people by producing pornography to explore their own interests and desires, and often to learn about their own bodies. That kink allows for an exploration of power and social identities in a way that participants can actually consent to. So unlike, for example, experiences of sexism that people might have in their daily lives, which are thrust upon them, where we don't necessarily have control over those things, that kink allows us to create a space in which we can decide whether or not we're experiencing sexism. That people, and especially women, should be liberated as free individuals who have the right to make their own choices about their bodies and about what brings them pleasure. This is a sort of fundamental tenet of sex-positive feminism. And that problematic symbols and activities can be given a new social context through kink. So a slur, for example, or a symbol that might be a hate symbol in some contexts, that partners can negotiate a new meaning for what those symbols can mean. So this is the sex-positive view of what kink is. Sex-negative views of kink take a very different approach to it. So for example, they'll say that pornography is fundamentally harmful, that most kinky pornography is just videotaping a violent abuse of a pornographic actress, that women are being objectified through pornography, and that watching pornography leads to real-world violence against women. This is a very popular view, especially in a lot of 1980s feminism, but some of it still persists today. Another view is that only relationships with equal power can be feminist. If you have any kind of relationship where one person is submitting to another, and especially for a woman who's fetishizing submission, that this view says that they've internalized all of these really negative values from society. So there's all these negative values that exist, and they are taking it within themselves. Some of them will argue that any kind of consent that somebody is giving, somebody freely agreeing to give something, isn't really free, because we exist in a society that so strongly conditions people to agree to things that they may not actually be interested in, and especially women. And that lastly, that there are symbols that get used in kink, so things like a master-slave relationship, or racist epithets, or the use of military uniforms, that ultimately cannot be removed from their socio-cultural context. That a hate symbol is always a hate symbol, and there's no way to recreate what that means. Or calling someone master or slave is so tied up with the historical experience of slavery that there's no new meaning that can be given to it. And so to get some practice thinking through what this is like, what I would like everybody to do is to watch this short video. And while, okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about how kink interests can intersect with other social identities. So things like age or disability, or sexual orientation, or gender or race. And we're going to focus mostly on gender or race during this conversation. So gender is a particularly important thing for a lot of kinky people. And so often we think of gender as something that is a form of performance, that our gender expression is something that we're engaging in our daily lives, by the kinds of clothes we wear, by the mannerisms we choose about how we walk or how we speak, by how we wear our hair, that all of these things are ultimately a form of socially constructed performance. That society decides that something like a skirt means feminine, even though all it really is a tube with a smaller hole and a larger hole, right? And there's nothing inherently gendered about that. And so this idea comes from Judith Butler, who's writing in the 90s, and she's arguing that gender is a performance. And like gender, a lot of kink is also thought of as a performance. So for example, there are scenes, there are roles, there are props, there are costumes. Often there's a kind of script that people are following. And so if both of these things are ultimately performance, it might make sense that we're going to see a lot of interaction between kink and between gender. And so one thing that kink can do is it can allow people to perform gender roles or identities that they may not be free to in their daily lives. So for example, we see a really popular fetish that exists online is feminization, where typically heterosexual cisgender men are interested in being dressed up as women in order to get sexual pleasure. And I want to be very clear, a lot of these people are not people who are transgender, right? So transgender identity is an entirely separate experience from this. This is more about cross-sex fantasy play. So this is someone who, in their daily life, they identify as a man, typically they're heterosexual, but yet this is something that they enjoy doing in their spare time as a form of recreation. And this may have to do, if you remember back to those triangles, to the stresses around having to be a man. That masculinity creates certain kinds of stresses in a person's life, and so if they see femininity as the opposite of masculinity, then that might become something that they would sexualize. On the flip side, there's a smaller number, though equally important for a lot of kinky people, of women who are into being masculinized. So being made into a sort of masculine version of themselves, things like having their hair cut short. And so this might be similarly someone that experiences a lot of stresses around femininity and sees masculinity as the opposite of that. And so in their free time, they're engaging in a form of experiencing masculinity in order to process through it. And interestingly, a lot of these gender dynamics can start to bleed into other kinds of roles. So one thing that appears to be the case in the kink community is that for people that like to take on the roles of animals, dogs are very common as the trope for a lot of men, and cats are very common as the trope for a lot of women. I don't know if anybody has ever seen the cat mansion video that exists on YouTube. This keeps getting recommended in some people's feeds. But so often what we see is these kitty roles being taken on by women and pup roles being taken on by men. And that might have to do with the kinds of things that we ascribe to masculinity and the kinds of things we ascribe to dogs and the kinds of ideas we ascribe to femininity and the kinds of things we ascribe to cats, right? So we might think of dogs as being dumb and loyal and simple and strong and happy-go-lucky, right? These are the kinds of often sexist stereotypes we might have about men. And on the flip side, we might think of cats as being kind of manipulative and seductive and controlling and conniving and behind the scenes and slinky, right? These are all tropes that are often sexist stereotypes about women. And so it makes sense that we also are going to often end up seeing those things coming out in these kinds of kink contexts where people are exploring those roles and those elements of their identities. Okay. On the flip side, sometimes what people are really interested in is conforming to gender roles. So you might have people, for example, in this top image here, this comes from a pornographic video. It's a gay pornographic video in which a man is being forced to exercise on a treadmill. And so things like physical fitness and physical strength, right, which are meant to be sort of an idea of masculinity conventionally, you might see some people that are interested in sort of a hyper-exaggerated form of masculinity that they're experiencing. And on the flip side, a lot of the kinds of things you might see in a dominatrix's outfit are often a hyper-feminine form. So it's often things that hyper-emphasize the breasts, or they might focus on certain kinds of physical body movements that focus on sort of typical femininity and really exaggerated forms of femininity. We'll even see this in, for example, dominatrixes that perform in drag. Drag is the sort of quintessential example of hyper-exaggerated femininity. And so we'll see the same thing in these kink contexts too. And often, what's really interesting about this is that it can give people a sense of gender being something that's really constructed and performative. So when people are saying, this isn't the real me, this is something that I'm going to perform and explore in this space and in this time, then it sort of reinforces the way that we understand gender today as something that's very fluid and very constructed. Mm-hmm.
Why is it that we typically know more about drag queens, not so much about drag kings?
Good question. Part of it is numerical. There are more drag queens than there are drag kings. Part of it, I think, has to do with the way in which a cis man transgresses against gender norms can be treated much differently than the way that when a cis woman transgresses against gender norms. Some of this has to do with transmisogyny. So if a man is transgressing against the gender norms for men, they're often more likely to be experiencing violence as a result of that. They're often more likely to be ridiculed as a result of that. And so people that are doing it and then also sort of reclaiming it as this positive form of their own identity, those are people that might get more spectacle, I think. I think there's also something that's probably going on about the male gaze, that often when people that are presenting as feminine are looked at in media context, they often get a lot more attention, and the kinds of attention they get are very focused on the physical, right? So if you imagine in one of those terrible Transformers movies where the camera is panning up somebody's body, right, and barely even gets to their face, Yeah, so this is like the heterosexual male gaze. And so I think some of that is also playing into why we get so much, especially on television, of like drag queens being the ones that get all of the attention. I think those are parts of it. There may also be some stuff about sort of the history of burlesque and how burlesque is often focused on very like feminine forms. And burlesque has this role in playing into drag culture. So I think there might be a historical continuity there too. Yeah. So I think what's interesting here is that, you know, sort of like drag, it can have this effect of pointing out how gender is constructed, but also because these are things that people are embodying themselves, they may also sometimes get the sense of gender feeling more real. And so, for example, Gail Rubin, or sorry, not Gail Rubin, oh shoot, I'm forgetting their name now. Robin Bauer, there we go. Robin Bauer is a psychologist out in Germany, and they've done work where they've interviewed dyke and trans women and lesbian communities, and they've focused on how a lot of them have been able to renegotiate the names of body parts in order to re-experience certain elements. So by talking about what we might conventionally think of as female genitalia and labeling it as a cock, that can be a really reaffirming experience for a lot of trans men. Likewise, they've even done a paper where they looked at trans men who engage in adult diaper baby play, the kinds of things you saw towards the beginning. And so some of them use that as a way to re-experience a boyhood that they may not have had experience, the ability to experience early on. So there's some really interesting interview data that's coming out about that. That's all like super new stuff that's like the last year, basically. So there's still a lot of new research that's coming out in this area because there's so little research in the first place. And so this kind of gendered play can be interesting because it can both emphasize how constructed and performative gender is, but also can make it feel very real for some people who are looking for that experience. So I have one more video. So this is an example of a dominatrix who, I think they're in Australia, and they run a forced exercise salon where her clients pay her to make them exercise. And so while you're watching this video, lastly, I have a couple more topics to talk about. One is I want to talk about the legal context of what's going on with all of this.
Oh my God.
I love the one on the left. The one on the right here is the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom. They're the world's largest advocacy organization for people that are into kink and polyamory, so that's having multiple partners at the same time. And this is a particularly important organization because they're working to try to make kink legal. Most forms of kink are currently illegal in the United States, and the reason why is that consent is not recognized as an affirmative defense in US courts against assault. And there's some good reasons for that. Assault is really hard to prove. Like, it is notoriously really hard to prove in the context of domestic violence cases. And so often the concern, especially among a lot of domestic violence advocates, is that by allowing consent to be an affirmative defense against assault, it means it's even easier for people who are abusing their partners to be able to get off without being punished for that. And so one of the negative consequences of that is that for kinky people, they're in a really sort of strange legal territory. And this has led to some really negative outcomes. Most notably, in particularly embattled child custody dispute cases, we've seen divorcing couples that are bringing up each other's kink interests as a way to try and paint the other person as a potential abuser for their child. This has gotten better since 2013 because the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's a manual that's used by psychologists for diagnosing mental disorders. That manual changed in 2013 to make it clearer that you can be kinky without having one of the kink-related disorders that they put into that manual. And as long as you know the right lawyer, you're able to keep that stuff out of like a child custody dispute case where it doesn't really belong there. But on the other hand, you do get some local county prosecutors that will decide that in an effort to bring God back into the country, they'll choose to target a sexual minority group. So for example, in Attleboro, Massachusetts in the mid-2000s, there was a raid on a kink party and they arrested a whole bunch of people. So this stuff, it does get met with a lot of problems in the legal system, and this is an organization that's working on that. And they've made some pretty big successes, and so we're hoping to see more of that in the future. Last thing I want to talk about is intersectionality with race and kink. So you might have noticed from all the videos that we're talking about so far that there's a lot of white people in this. And that's generally been true in almost all the research that's been conducted on this, that white people are widely overrepresented in these communities. And I think there's three big reasons for this. One of the big reasons is non-consensual racial fetishization. So some folks of color who may have an interest in some of these elements of kink activities may join a kink website or go to a kink munch and then experience other people sexually fetishizing them for their race. And while this is certainly something that can happen in vanilla context, if you go to an OkCupid website as a person of color, you're going to get a bunch of those messages too. But particularly in a kink context where the assumption is it's okay to talk about what fetishes people have, that those things may become more explicit, and that can make it a really hostile environment for some folks of color. So that's one of the problems. Another of the problems is what we were briefly talking about before, that some kink involves the explicit appropriation of the language of slavery or of the language of other kinds of historical abuses that exist. And so for people that are still living with the legacy of those things, that can be particularly complicated. And then lastly, part of it has to deal with the way that class is racialized in the United States. So because of the long history of discrimination and slavery and redlining and other forms of discrimination that prevent families from accumulating wealth over the course of generations, in the US, socioeconomic status and race tend to be pretty closely tied together. And some elements of kink can get really darn expensive. Leather is really expensive. If you want a full-body latex suit, that can run you $600 easily. And so it might be that white people, who are generally people that have more wealth, may have more access to these kinds of things just simply because of class issues. But there are some wonderful people of color who in the kink community who are interested in these issues and work on them. And there are even people of color in the kink community that use their racial identity as part of the play that they're engaging in. So this is something called race play. So what I have on the left here is Melina Williams. She's a speaker and activist and part of the kink community in San Francisco. And she's somebody that engages in these forms of race play, where she does white-black plantation slavery scenarios with her husband, who she's married to. In the middle here is an author, I'm forgetting her name now, but she wrote the book The Color of Kink, and she talks about how often the experiences of people of color in these communities can be really complicated, especially as they're navigating pornographic contexts. And then lastly, I have here an image of what happens in at least some gay men's contexts where there's an appropriation of Nazi uniforms. And so what some people in those communities have done is they've banned the use of swastikas but allowed the use of the sort of style of the uniform as a way to get at the fetish but also avoid alienating people who are part of groups that have experienced hostility during the Holocaust. And so there's a lot of navigations that are still going on around race. And I just want to leave you with one other interesting way in which race has been reappropriated. So this is a dominatrix in the UK who pretty much explicitly sees just white clients. And part of what she does is makes them read black feminist theory. So the kinds of people like Audre Lorde as a way, and she sees much of her work as a form of reparations, that this is a way that she's using her own identity and a way to explore black feminism as a way to also get financial resources that are available for her and her community. And so kink is really complicated, and the experiences of kink for a lot of people of color can get especially complicated, but there are some really interesting spaces that are going on right now. So with that, I think I only have like 1 minute left, but I can take any questions that anyone has, and I will shut up.